Welcome to Personal Landscapes. I'm your host, Ryan Murdoch. You can find links for today's episode and other conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. Josef Koudelka was born in Czechoslovakia the year Germany annexed the Sudetenland, and his childhood was overshadowed by Nazi occupation. He lived under the post-war communist regime and watched Soviet tanks roll into Prague in 1968. His vivid photos of the Prague Spring led to a 20-year period of exile, wandering Europe as a stateless person, sleeping rough and photographing vanishing worlds. His work is permeated by feelings of tragedy, but the man himself is surprisingly optimistic, seizing on the present moment while appreciating the beauty of life. I was intrigued by his wandering artist's existence, and so I reached out to his biographer to get a sense of the man behind the aesthetic legend. Melissa Harris is the author of Josef Koudelka Next. She's the editor-at-large of the Aperture Foundation and was editor-in-chief of Aperture magazine for over a decade. She's edited over 40 books for Aperture and has curated photography exhibits throughout the United States and Europe. We spoke about Koudelka's wandering life, his remarkable network of friends, and his interest in capturing the death of things. One quick note before we jump in. Many of you have written to ask how you can support Personal Landscapes. I'm launching a new members club as a way to cover the costs of the show, costs that until now I've paid from my own savings. The club should be live by the time this episode is released or very soon after. I'll say more about the exciting extras I have in store for members in the next episode. Until then, you can find out more about it by visiting personallandscapes.com. And now, here's my conversation about Josef Koudelka with Melissa Harris. I normally talk about books and writers on this podcast, so some of my listeners may not be familiar with the man we're discussing today. So who is Josef Koudelka, and why did you decide to write his biography?
Okay, Josef Koudelka is an extraordinary photographer. He was born in 1938, and he was in a little village in what was Czechoslovakia, and eventually came to Prague and got very, very, I'm going to summarize this very quickly. He got extremely interested in photography as a young man, also, but was an aeronautical engineer because of the system, the political system there. He couldn't really be an artist because artists were considered parasites until he got accepted by a union, and eventually, which he was. But he studied airplanes first, which was his first love, and photography was his second. And he ended up bearing witness, I should say, to the Soviet invasion of Prague in 1968, and basically just worked 24/7 for 1 week documenting what was happening, documenting this invasion. And then eventually had to go into exile out of fear, really, for himself and his family. And the photographs were all labeled PP for a very long time for Prague photographer, but never were attributed to him, again, to avoid certain risks. And the photographs were distributed by Magnum, the photographic cooperative, of which he eventually became a member. But before he was a member, Elliot Erwitt had seen the photographs thanks to Peter Keane, an editor in London, and basically got Magnum, which was he didn't have to twist any arms. The photographs were amazing, to distribute them worldwide. But again, as I said, under the attribution of PP. So this is kind of, in some ways, how he got his first recognition. But before he was even that was kind of 1 week of intense reportage. But before that, he had been doing a lot of work on the Roma, and he published a book called Gypsies, but when Gypsies was not yet understood as such a pejorative term as it is now. He did that with the French publisher Delpire and the American publisher Aperture. And that was work he had done all over. He'd done in Romania, he'd done in Czechoslovakia, he'd done some work in Poland. So he was this was in the 60s. And he also was photographing for money. He was working for a theater magazine. So he photographed a great deal of theater. And then suddenly he found himself living in England in exile. And he was looking at Roma throughout the UK, but also began going to festivals and all other kinds of projects.
You've touched on so many of the things I'd like to come back to. I'm intrigued by his work and his travels, but this is going to be challenging because we're discussing photography on an audio podcast, and because I've always had an innate feeling for the rhythm of words, but I have no visual sense at all. So I hope you'll bear with me if I ask really stupid
Yeah,
or obvious
please,
questions.
please.
So when you look at Joseph Koudelka's work, what do you see as an editor, as a
Come on.
curator? How would you sort of encapsulated. We'll go into the details of the different phases of his career bit by bit, but what do you think are the main
Well,
characteristics of?
I need to because I no longer can distinguish my first impressions of his work from working 10 years on his biography. Okay. Um, and those are two really different things because anything I say now about Joseph's work is going to be absolutely infused with what I know about his life and spending so much time talking to him. So I don't know if I can give that fresh visual impression. I can say that his study of airplanes and all the issues of engineering play into the work because the sense of balance, the sense of composition in the work is quite extraordinary. There is a reason for everything, which of course fits into his personality too. You have somebody who's very obsessive and deeply engaged with what he does and keeps returning to it and returning to it and returning to it, not to repeat, but to keep trying to better himself. So you think of somebody who's working like that. So when you look at the work, every detail in there, every tonality, every object is a decision. Okay. He's not like his friend Cartier-Bresson with a kind of decisive moment approach. I mean, there are images he's made like that, of course, and certainly the 68 coverage was just about responding to what was going on. But the other work, like Roma, Exiles, Roma, the work on the Roma called Gypsies, Exiles, and the work he's done on the wall, separation barrier between Israel and Palestine. All of this work is so deliberate and is so composed and is so much about balance and weight and tonality. And so, in a way, I look at his work and there's a kind of weird perfection to it. And I don't really know that there's any such thing as perfection. I don't necessarily, and I don't mean to say his work is perfect, but I mean, in terms of the way he realizes it, there's everything is so determined. And there aren't, and that's a very interesting thing in photography. That's not to say there aren't happy accidents. I'm sure he discovers something and it's not something that he might have imagined. And then he works on it because he travels with since he returns and often returns to projects and to places to try to perfect the image. He's constantly looking at his contact sheets and all these things to see what he's done before and can he make it better. So if there's an happy accident, that might be incorporated into whatever he does next. But so I think of the work as having this kind of balance and obsessiveness and perfection and detail and I love the work with the earlier work, like on the Roma with the people. I think you get all those things I'm talking about, but you also get someone who is not remotely judgmental or romanticizing or exoticizing. So to me, that is really interesting because most work we see on any group that is outside of our own, and especially if they're somehow indigenous peoples of some way or another, are generally tend to be so exoticized or romanticized or sentimentalized or judged. And Joseph manages to do this work without doing any of that. It is just so there's this kind of weird I don't quite know how he does it, except it's a little bit about the way he is in the world. But if he has preconceptions, he lets them go. And he works hard at with the Roma, I don't think there was an issue. I don't think he had preconceptions. I think he was absolutely fascinated, and that was that. Certainly when he went to Israel, I think he worked very hard to try to let he didn't like the politics of Israel. He liked some of the people he met there, including this remarkable assistant that he had working with him, Gilad Baram, who ended up making a film on this work. But I think Joseph had to work very, very hard to separate the photographic process from what he understood of what was going on politically, because this hit him right at home. As he says himself, I know walls. He knows this. He talks, of course, first about the Iron Curtain, but then he moves up from there.
That's interesting too. The span of his life is something that I found really interesting. He was born in 1938, the year the Nazis annexed the Sudetenland, and he lived under Nazi occupation as a child. Um, he lived under the Soviet occupation. Those were all periods when you don't have any sense of control. So you're talking about the sense of control he exhibited, or he exerted over his work, was so strong. I wonder if it was kind of a subconscious reaction to having grown up without any control as a child. I wonder if there was some element of compensating for that.
I mean, I'm loath to do a psychological profile on him.
Mm.
But I think first of all, he had a father who was very anti, the Soviet occupation and of course the Nazis and all that. And he thought they were foolish. And he really, from everything Joseph has told me and what Joseph's sister told me, their father taught them to think for themselves. So I think that he had a kind of childhood where he was told his own thoughts matter and that he was smart enough to consider the situation on his own and not believe what people tell him. Now, and then of course that those trust issues go through life as well, so those don't change either. Um, but so I think he always had some sense of agency, given the way he was growing up. And his sister did work. I mean, it's a little bit in the biography. I mean, she volunteered for the resistance, and so I mean, they were engaged. And he went to a boarding school in Prague, very far away from home, very early. I think he was 14, if I remember, something like that. And there too, these kids, even though they were in a Soviet system and were being taught, they were smart and they understood what they were being taught was very different in many cases from what they had learned at home. And they sort of, it sounds like, after talking to Joseph and again some of his high school friends, one or two of them, that they knew that they were being duped, and that once they understood that they could speak to each other safely, that they talked. And so I think that his background, it was very important for him to feel free always and to feel in control of everything and his own decisions. And that's in part, it's, the nature nurture aspects here. I don't know, because I think that seems to me so so much, it's so intrinsic to the person I've come to know that I can't imagine that it wouldn't have been there anyway. But of course, it was reinforced by having to, in ways that you and I didn't have to do. He had to assert this sense, in at least to himself, of I am free, I am in control, I get to do what I want, you know, and that I can. He was brought up with enough confidence to believe that if he worked hard and he did this, he could do it.
That mistrust of words under the communist system, that comes up there was a quote in the book where he says, I realized that I could learn more about people if I looked at their faces and listened not to what they said, but how they said it. So how do you think that's reflected in his work?
It might be why he's interested in being a photographer. He believes what he sees. I mean, more than what he hears. So you can imagine that somebody who feels that way is likely to do something visual if they have those talents and interests. Um, but I don't think his idea. I mean, his work on the Soviet invasion is the only time that he was really setting out to bear witness to something. And he understood that this was critical and it was reflexive also for him. I don't think he would thought. I think he just went out and did it, you know? And of course, he's thinking while he's doing it because he's a smart and thinking individual. But it never occurred to him to stop, compose, wait, is this right? Should I go? I mean, he was just out on the street immediately. And that's also part of his personality. But I mean, part of it is he's also not a big reader. So, I mean, some of it is just the way he understands the world. So again, we're back to what is the nature nurture thing. Like Joseph is an extremely visual person. That's kind of how he takes things in. Now, it works in that if he wasn't visual, if it didn't work for him, he'd have to depend more on words because he wouldn't have the faith in his visual acumen, if that makes any sense. It's a good question. I haven't really thought about it. Um, but I think because he's so naturally adept at this and then trusts his visual instincts so much and is operating in so many languages where he doesn't always trust both his understanding and of course he understand when he was dealing and listening to Czech, that was one thing. But, so I think in other countries too, when he first was learning different languages, first learning English, first learning French, Spanish, he had to rely on people's gestures and their inflections, even the tone of their voice and their facial expressions and all those other things we all try to rely on when we're in a place where we're not sure about the language or we're learning it. So I think it's an incredible combination of things, and some of it is just he's naturally gifted visually. That's what he trusts. It's what he trusts in himself, and therefore, I think it would interpret to and it's evidentiary. I mean, people say a lot of stuff, right? And of course, as we say, the system in which he grew up in, he understood he couldn't trust what anybody said. So that stuff, that kind of attitude would stay with you. But if we want to, as humans, Joseph is also one of the most hopeful people I've ever met. He's incredibly hopeful. He doubts, he doesn't trust, but he's full of hope. And so if you want to be hopeful in the world, in a weird way, you have to believe in something. So maybe he believes in what he sees. I don't know. I mean, I don't mean to be playing Junior Freud here. I've never really thought about it in this way, but I think it's really interesting.
So you've mentioned that some of his earliest photographic work was in the theater.
Yeah.
So what did he learn from that? What influence did that have on what came later? Because it seems like he did it quite differently than other people were doing at the time.
Well, first of all, he learned to make demands, because at first he was doing it, for for this theater company, sorry, for this theater magazine, and he was doing in part what they wanted, but he still was doing it differently just because of his, let's say, his sensibility. But then when he started really working more for this company and this particular director, he agreed to it with rules, as he puts it. There are lots of rules with us. And I think, he learned that he could set, a set of rules for how he would or would not agree to do something, and if people wanted him badly enough, they'd accept them. And so I think let's start with that. We could talk visually of what he learned. I mean, let's say working on the Roma and using a wide angle lens helped him to think about the theater, and the theater helped him to work on the Roma and understand action and all of this. Um, and drama and moments of tension and so I think that they certainly would help each other, and he certainly learned from working on the theater that as much as life was also a theater, he was interested in the life theater more than the written theater, but or the acted theater, I should say. But I think one of the main things he learned was that he could uh tell people what he wanted to do and give them basically an ultimatum. If you want me, you'll accept this. Otherwise, I don't care. And he didn't care. And they accepted it. Especially really smart people accepted it because they understood they were getting something from him. And so I think that I mean, he might not say this at all. Please understand, I am speaking for me. I am not speaking for Yosef. But I think that would have been one of the major things he learned was this. Um, and I think but the other thing is, because he was not a big reader, he was exposed to some of the best literature of our world at that time by working in the theater. Okay, I mean, he wasn't reading it, but because of the way he worked, he would go to several rehearsals. He'd go and he'd go and he'd go. So you hear King Lear 4 times, or you hear Ubu Ra 4 times. So it's not necessarily, some of it's Shakespeare and some of it is the most avant-garde literature of that moment. You're exposed to this in a way that most of us probably aren't, even though we may read more than he did. So I think that it just became part of him. He was open to it, and he understood narrative in a certain way through this, and that might have helped him, not so much in the later work because he wasn't really in the work that's more landscape oriented. Um, the narratives are less literal anyway. They exist, or the drama exists, but you're not having a literal, narrative. But I think all of those things would have all of it basically. I don't wanna say that it influenced the work, but it's part of the work. I mean, that people use the word, somebody's like a sponge, but Joseph is like that. Everything that he is exposed to, he takes in. It doesn't and he processes it in his own way, in his own time, but he can draw on it. I mean, and, I think in that way, theater helped him enormously, and he understood things. He understood magazines. He understood, design and layout, all those things, because there were things he didn't like about how his photographs were used, and then there were things that he especially liked. So why didn't he like something in one issue, but why did he love the spread on King Lear, for example? So he began to process, "Okay, this is what I like if my work is published. This is what matters to me." So I think that the lessons were broad, and they weren't necessarily a specific photo lesson, except that he could also experiment. He could blow up things, he could rephotograph them. He was playing a lot in the theater because he felt at liberty to. And those experiments, and then he started doing what he called experiments with his non-theater work, or I don't remember the chronology, maybe he was doing those first, probably. But but they each helped the other. Things he was doing on the outside, he tried in the theater work. Things he tried in the theater, he would do with his other work, and he was learning. He was constantly learning.
You've got some really cool descriptions too about how he got right inside the play. Like he would go to dress rehearsals and move among the actors and shoot it from all these bizarre angles and get right in the middle of the action.
Well, that's what I mean. That was like, who's gonna make that demand, right? Who's gonna think a director is gonna let you be on stage during, and that's where he learned that he could make the most outrageous, at some level, demand, and that if the director could say no, and then Joseph didn't care. But in this case, the director was so compelled by Joseph's work. I imagine, again, I didn't speak with him, but when everything I've read I didn't speak with him because he died. I tried to speak with everybody I could possibly speak with. But, based on what he's written and what I did interview 2 of the actors in the theater company, um, he was compelled by what Joseph wanted to do, and they were able to ignore him. I mean, Joseph is agile, and he understood his presence at some level, at least as a photographer. And I think he moved about them, and they were playing their parts, and they were good actors and actresses, and they were doing their thing. And it sounds like they were able to, I don't know if the right word is ignore, but they were able to I don't know, 'cause it's not me, but I mean, at least they were able to somehow compartmentalize it. So they did their thing. It didn't apparent If it had interfered with what was going on dramatically, the director would have said, "Forget it. I can't have you on stage when they're rehearsing. We're not achieving what we need to achieve here." But apparently didn't. And this was a director who is not doing avant-garde theater. I mean, Joseph did photograph some more avant-garde work, but this was not that, and this director was incredibly open-minded. I mean, I can't imagine anybody, I mean, I don't know, I'm not in the world of theater, but to me, demand, the rule was off the charts, and can you imagine somebody agreeing to this? And the director did. So, and the results are astonishing because he is on the stage and he's documenting theater like a photojournalist at some level. And that is so meta to me. You know, it's like, okay, we have the all the world's a stage moment. We have Joseph out on the street. We have him in the theater. He knows what's happening, and that's why he would go to so many rehearsals. So he knows what the action is going to be in this case. So there's not that spontaneity, but he's looking, how can he photograph this so it feels live at some level? His photographs of theater are amazing. I've never seen photographs like that. To me, I mean, and no, most people don't even know that he did this work. If you don't read my biography and you don't see one of his retrospectives, it's really not work. Now there's a book that's been published of it, a small book of the theater work, but that's not widely circulated and I mean, it should be, but I don't know that it's gotten lots of buyers, but because maybe people don't know. But I mean, his theater work is so unusual. Because and of course, why would he be interested in documenting the theater? The theater is already um, is dramatizing something that already exists. So how would that be interesting to a photographer like Joseph to do that at some level? So I shouldn't say that because of course there are some wonderful uh, theater photographers and dance photographers who have figured out how to do this without insisting that they be on stage for 5 rehearsals. So and that's another challenge entirely. But I think what he did was very revolutionary in terms of this kind of photography.
It's one of the things that I found really surprising about your book. I'd never seen any of this before, and it wasn't publicity shots for a play. It really captured the emotion of the film, and you see some of this of the play, but you see some of this in his Prague Spring photos too. The way he captures emotion and facial expressions and contorted bodies and acts of resistance, and he's right there in the thick of it, shooting
Yeah.
it from the inside, just like in the theater.
Yeah, and I mean, so all these things, that's the thing. He soaks in everything. Everything's going to be channeled eventually. So maybe because, of course, the work in the Roma, you have some amazing facial expressions too. So which comes first? Is it the Roma, and then all of a sudden you realize when you're working in the theater that you want to focus on the expressions and the gestures because you know that that's more intense than stepping back and just doing the scene on the stage, which is what often happens. And then, or does your work on the theater help develop your other work because you realize that the most interesting theater pictures you're getting are the gestures? I don't know. The chicken egg thing I can't um really speak to, but I know it all because he is so intense as an individual and he is so obsessed that there's nothing that doesn't sink in. And then it becomes natural, instinctive. I mean, Joseph's instincts are great, okay? You couldn't do the Prague work if your instincts weren't great. So that is something that maybe the instincts weren't perhaps challenged in any other way like that before he did that work, because he was really responding to events happening like this, where his life was at stake too, where he was and he was climbing on tanks and he was doing all kinds of things. So you could say, okay, either he was under the influence of enormous adrenaline and or he's fearless. I don't know. I mean, there's some aspect of fearlessness or kookiness or just such obsessiveness to get the photograph that you don't even think, that you're not even thinking about those other things. And then his instincts from the Roma, from the theater, to go so close in on, as you're saying, on those facial expressions or the gestures or the leaning in, like all the things that make those photographs so unusual and so different from most of the photographs we see of this kind of uh, aggression, because you're seeing, and especially because he's focusing on the resistance, so you're seeing the expressions of the Czech people saying no, and I think as he says, this is like this one moment in one's life is amazing, and it's also the moment where we as a people came together and we're at our best. So, and I think you get that from those photographs. You get that the Czech people were one, and they were not going to let themselves be easily taken, easily occupied. They were going to stand and fight.
So you said that the Prague Spring was also a prelude to what would be a 20-year period of exile. So he got an exit visa to photograph the annual gypsy gathering at Saint-Marie-de-la-Mer in the south of France, and he just never came back. He became a stateless person. So even the status on his refugee documents said nationality doubtful, which is that's an interesting description. So, and it was at this time that he developed a sort of philosophy of life summed up in a diary quote that you included in your book from the early 1970s, where he said, "Never stay for a long time in one place. When you stop somewhere, things start to stick to you. When you go from one place to another place, you are cleaning yourself." So could you describe some of his life during that time? I mean, he developed a sort of a reputation almost as a monk or an ascetic for the way he lived.
Um, he didn't want to rely on anybody. He didn't, because of his background, he had a complicated relationship with money. I mean, he didn't want it. He wanted just what he needed, and what he needed to photograph and to survive, but he didn't see that as meaning that he had a I'm not quite sure how to put this. He didn't want to own things. He didn't want to buy things. He wanted to be free. And his idea of freedom was included not having too much, because he felt that ultimately having a home, having a car, having a lot of money he saw them more as trappings as opposed to things that helped your life or were liberating. And he didn't have the money. Of course, he did, he had certain things, but it wasn't like but he got grants, and he was able to extend these grants much longer than most people could because of the way he lived, which was mostly outside, not having a home, staying at people's homes. And so Joseph is very, he has a life he creates a life philosophy that both works for him and reflects him. I don't know how, it helps him to affirm how he's living, and it also is true to the way he's living. But he states it. He kept journals these entire times. He kept diaries. And he's always writing this in his diary about this desire to be free, unattached. And so, some people think, "Oh my God, he's a Buddhist." But and there are things, of course, the non-attachment, you could say, yes, okay, that's part of Buddhism, there's part of this. I mean, he grew up Catholic. But I think it's not he doesn't want an alliance to any particular belief system at all, whether it be religious or political or just the norm of how people in the West live. And he didn't want to be corrupted by the West. He felt that having less, that the one thing by because he first started his work as or his life as a photographer with less, he didn't have lots of resources. He didn't have the promise of a huge payment if he did this job for this magazine or this, company. He did what he wanted because there wasn't really any reason not to at some level. And he didn't want to lose that. That's part of the freedom. And he didn't want to succumb to needing or wanting more. And he watched that. So it was this constant sort of dance with what the West had to offer, um, which was another kind of freedom, but what he was giving up, which he felt had instilled in him this freedom from wanting stuff, whether it was money or a home or all of this. And so he lived in a way that most people don't, or choose not to, or can't. Um, and he could do that at that time. I don't know whether it would be as easy to do now. I just don't know. But then the topics he was interested in allowed him to travel and live nomadically and camp, and he was very comfortable doing that. And then he understood his time, and in the winter time when he would that's when he would work more in the dark room, and he would live at friend once he became part of Magnum. He met several people, especially David Hearn at the time, who basically put him up. and he could stay there as long as he wanted. So it wasn't that he didn't have places to go. People offered him their homes all the time, but they weren't his home. He wasn't responsible for it. He could leave anytime he wanted to without feeling he was leaving people or places that he needed to take care of. And then he would send postcards. I mean, he tried to stay connected to his friends and the people who were being so kind to him. It's through sending postcards. So people have a lot of different postcards from Joseph.
That's interesting. You mentioned this quest for freedom and all these decisions that he made in his life to ensure his freedom, even right down to removing unnecessary choices, the need to make unnecessary choices. So you describe him wearing the same black jeans and multi-pocketed olive-colored shirt all the
Yes.
time. So just like that's just something I don't want to think about.
Yeah.
I don't
Why
need,
bother? Why think about what I have to wear this morning? He
and then it
just,
frees your brain up to focus on what you want to focus on.
which
It's
is
interesting.
exactly. And he doesn't want to waste time. He has a very, very keen sense of time. And he just wants to utilize it to the best of his ability, which is pretty powerful. So why think about taking care of a home? Why think about what you're going to wear? Let's, as you say, eliminate as many choices as we can. We know we have them. That's good. But now we don't have to think about them anymore because we have them and we've made the choice. Black pants, green top, boom, out. Never have to think about that again. And it works for him. But his freedom, of course, is intertwined totally with this idea of independence. And I guess those are two different things, but they brush up against each other very closely, especially in his life.
Well, you mentioned too this his approach to managing his time. You quote his cousin Tonda saying his approach to life was such that he had a precise minute by minute plan for his work, the tasks, whatever he wanted to
And
build.
this was as a kid.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's amazing. But this exactitude, he brought it to every element of his work. It sounded like you quote people who worked with him in the printing room and saying how difficult his negatives were to print and how he exasperated people involved in printing his books because he was just constantly rearranging them and trying to perfect them and resequencing them all the time. So, I mean, you've edited a number of books for other photographers. How did that experience inform your understanding of Koudelka's work and his approach to these things?
It made me think Del Piero is a saint. Uh, no, I think, look, people people like me, okay, people who work with artists, um, there are certain people you just make allowances for because you realize that they're doing it to achieve something that really matters to them. Yes, it's ego at some level, of course, but it's not narcissism. And it's a kind of I want to do the best project I can possibly do. And there's something very compelling about that. It makes you want to help to facilitate that because they're not saying, look, we got to sell at least 50,000 books and I have to make X amount of money and this is the advance I want and blah, 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 blah. It's not capitalist. It's not about fame. It's not, of course, Joseph, he wants to be known. He wants something, he's like still a guy and he's still a human being. So he wants attention, but that's not the goal in making this. The goal is to make the most what he thinks where he doesn't think he could do it any better. He constantly says this. He uses the term the maximum. So when you're working with somebody like that who's not trying to rush the process in anything, it's like the complete opposite. You just decide to go with it at some level because the work is worth it, the person is worth it, and the process is interesting. You're gonna learn from it. Look, when Magnum Foundation came to me, when Susan Meiselas came to me about doing this book, I laughed. I said, "Jay, he's never going to do it. He's not gonna wanna spend his time this way." And, basically, and I also wasn't sure he'd wanna work with me. I mean, even though I knew we'd done some work together before, that doesn't mean he'd wanna do this with me. And I don't think he initially wanted to do this biography, but people told him, "Look, if you don't do it while you're alive, we all get to say whatever we want when you're dead." And maybe it's true, maybe it's not. One friend, his friend Hervé Tardy, really egged him on this way. And the part of Joseph that wants things to be accurate and precise and his true story, that was, that compelled him to do it. And so I was actually surprised when I was asked to do ideas. I'm like, yeah, sure. And then all of a sudden it was happening. And I was pleased, of course, but then they said, okay, so you'll turn this in 2 years and we'll do it in 3 years or something. I'm like, are you kidding me? I said, forget it. I know enough about working with Joseph. I've hardly worked with him, but I know certain things about people who have worked with him. You can't give me a deadline on this. This is going to be, if I'm doing this, I'm just doing it because I think it's worth it. Okay. We know that I'm not going to make any money on this or anything. I mean, it's like my dad at some point said to me, he goes, I think you did better when you were a babysitter. And,
Yeah, that's publishing, that's for sure.
so, you know, and if you want to amortize it for 10 years of work, but, and it was true to form. I mean, and he knew we had these rules. I was like, you can't tell me what to write, and you can't tell other people what to say. I'm interviewing everybody, and you have to accept what they say. Now, if you tell me something is factually incorrect, you don't call them up. I call them up and I say, blah, blah, blah. And we see if we can work it through. If you have a difference of opinion, I can have your opinion, but you don't get to change theirs. So, and he was great about that because in part of it, despite how controlling he is, the way he grew up, he does not want to tell people what to say or what to think or what to write. And he was not remotely censorious in that way. So it ended up being great. But it took a very, very long time because he's probably read the book more than I have in process because he was looking especially at his own quotes, and his English is good. But he was saying, wait, what? It was like he was saying, you say, now I can't think of an example, but he would compare 3 words and he'd say, "Why do we use this word here and this word here? Do they mean the same things or whatever?" And I would tell him, "God, this is like taking the SATs." And then I would have to explain what the SATs were. And so everything, and then there would be like, "Why do you say the here?" And I said, "Well, here we so so it was a long process. And so but I was prepared for it, and I think that I guess this is a long-winded way of answering your question, that people like Del Pier, who really did this most with Joseph and had to go through those early books where the whole process was new to him, and he didn't care at all about time or money or anything. He just wanted to get it right, and it wasn't like, or even recently, that when they were not reprinting, but printing a new edition of Gypsies at Steidl, he didn't care how many times Steidl ran it and what this was going to cost Steidl. If Joseph was going to do it, he wanted the book he wanted. Otherwise, why bother? Than this whole new edition. So I think he just again has these expectations, and he's not asking people. As I said, it's because he's not saying, and I want you to pay me $1,000,000 and I want blah, 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 blah. He's just saying, I want it the way I want it. And it's really, in a way, that's a very simple demand. And it's about excellence and it's about perfection. And people want that. I mean, we all want our projects to be excellent and as perfect as they can be and feel like there's nothing we would do over if we had the opportunity to do it over. That's a very kind of rare and sought after experience. I mean, but these things matter. So I think people in this particular field who are not necessarily doing it commercially, but are engaged for other reasons, um, you're sort of all in. But that's also because the work is so good. You wouldn't do that where if you thought the work was mediocre, it wouldn't be worth your time. I don't mean to be harsh, but it just wouldn't be. I mean, no matter how great the person was, it'd be like, okay, but really, this is really just a tree. So, but I mean, with somebody like Koudelka, it's a tree. So then you're like, okay, I got to give this tree its treeness or whatever it is. But I'm being a little goofy, but I think that that's why people do it. They respect him, they respect the work, and they believe in his goals for this maximum, and they want to achieve it not just for him, for themselves, because it's interesting to be challenged like that too, you know?
So, in addition to the professional people in his orbit, you mentioned earlier that during his period of exile, he developed a really remarkable network of friends, people who gave him a place to sleep and who fed him and washed and mended his clothes, who invited him to family gatherings, who gave him access to dark rooms when he couldn't afford it. That really stood out in your book, the importance of friendships in his life. But I get the sense that, as with work, he wasn't always an easy person to be friends with. Like you say, his friends and collaborators regularly engaged beyond the call of duty, often forsaking all financial and other concerns to help him realize his desires. And some friends or former friends have described him as an egomaniac, someone who does what he wants when he wants, a selective listener, which I get described as that at home sometimes. Someone unwilling to tolerate any discussion of matters that don't interest him. But other friends insist on interpreting him more generously, and those who have traveled or worked with him accept him on his own terms. So, what is it about him that inspires such loyalty and understanding in friends rather than in professional colleagues?
Some of the same things. I think people, the person you're talking about who helped him so much, one of the people is Sheila Hicks, who's an amazing artist in her own right. And she understood Joseph because she's not so different. She's tenacious, she's stubborn, she's exceptional at what she does. She wants what she wants. She had her own fights as a woman, as somebody working in textiles, which was sort of diminished. And she rose above it. And she's extraordinary. And she guided him in some ways about just like whether or not you want to, you kind of have to live in the world a certain way. So your clothes have to be clean. You can't have rips everywhere. And she had a studio that tried to help him make sure that, they sewed up his clothes and they cleaned them. And when they were no longer salvageable, she sometimes used them in textile in her work. But I think the loyalty comes again from the same place it does really with the people working with him, is that in part, which is that you understand that it isn't about somebody saying, I'm so wonderful all the time. It's about somebody who is so driven and so, in some ways, myopically driven and so goal oriented and so intense about what he does that this is just you either accept him for this or you can't be his friend because there's no bait and switch with Joseph. He is who he is. He doesn't get you thinking that he's going to be the most generous and gracious individual you've ever met, and then all of a sudden you're like, "Oh, not really." But he is true to himself. He doesn't lie. He's very clear and transparent, and that's interesting to people. And I think, again, you're in a situation that people believe in him. They admire the drive and the candor, and they learn to manage expectations at some level too, in terms of certain norms of friendship. The thing about him is that he is actually quite loyal. So if you don't lie to him and you're clear with him, you're okay. What he has a hard time with, because he doesn't, is any kind of duplicity. Let's say we all do, but no, people do give white lies, and I'm not saying, I'm sure he does white lies and all those kinds of things, but like real out and out duplicity where you say one thing and you do another and all of that, he can't tolerate that because he truly doesn't understand it. He doesn't understand that everybody is not as candid as he is, and people don't always say exactly what they think, and then it can get more complicated from there. But so I think his friendships come, and of course, especially with some of the photographers, they really admire him. I say it in the book too, where some of them want to be like him and feel like they can't be. And some of them will say, well, I have family, I have a wife, I have a kid, I have a husband, I have, a mom I'm taking care of, whatever it may be. Or I'm just not as driven, or I like to go out to dinner more, whatever it might be. But that they have enormous respect for the way that he is, and so they're willing to, let's say, accept him on his own terms, and that's great, and his terms are clear, and as I said, there's no bait and switch, and so I think that I think that doesn't necessarily excuse some of his way of being sometimes. There are moments where you're just like, "No, you can't say that," or you just stop. You're being obnoxious. But you can't say, "Well, you're not being yourself," because it's all him. And so if you decide to engage with him as a friend, as a collaborator, you know what you're getting and you know what you've signed up for and you accept it. And why not? Because there are things about it that make it worth it.
I think great writers are great because they're imbalanced. I think every writer is imbalanced for sure, and that imbalance tilts towards their talent and away from other things. I mean, nobody can be completely perfect or the all
No.
rounded person. So you spend
It'd
a
be
lot of
so
time together.
dull. We don't
They would be
kind
though.
of perfection. That's really not that interesting. We want the obsession. We want I can't think about anything else right now. I have to work on this. Whether it's stated or just the action.
So what surprised you most? You spent a lot of time together working on this book. What was the most surprising kind of revelation for you?
I think it was actually, this is going to sound weird. I think it was my own. Two things happen. One is you can do something like this and either end up like if you're interviewing the person, if the person is alive, in fact, and you're focusing much more on their work than you ever did, no matter what your job is or whatever, you can either end up liking them more or less and appreciating their work more or less. I didn't know what would happen here, and I didn't ask myself the question. I knew it would be complicated to work with him because I knew, as I said, I knew enough of what had happened with other people, especially with Del Pierre, and also Joseph and I had worked together before. I knew what I was getting myself into. Um, so I guess in terms of what surprised me, and this is more of a personal response, it has more to do with me, so excuse me, than it has to do with Joseph, is I had always admired his panoramics of the landscapes, and but I don't know that I ever quite warmed up to them. I could respect them, but I didn't love them. That doesn't mean I didn't trying to see how to put this. Um, I thought they were really excellent, but I didn't have the same feeling for them as I did for, let's say, the work on the Roma or Exiles or the 68 coverage or the theater even, because they seemed colder to me. The landscape images, not so much the work on archaeological sites in ruins, but some of the more industrial sites. I think what happened is as I learned, as I saw more, and especially when I went to an exhibition in Bologna where there were so many at the correct size exhibited and juxtaposed with each other and not kind of isolated with so much space as happens in a gallery and I really saw 40 works or whatever was in the show. My appreciation for them grew exponentially. I was blown away, and I had the same feeling for them as I had for the other work, and I didn't expect that. That was actually the biggest. It was a personal surprise, and it was about my own, I don't know, growth or something because I mean, he wasn't imposing anything on me. You got to like these. I never shared my feelings about them with him. I just accepted that, like in any artist's work, you're going to like one piece more than others. You're a novelist, you're going to like one or two novels more than you like others. So this was normal. Um, but I understood it about my own feelings, but it wasn't something we discussed because it's the norm. So having this almost, I mean, it literally felt like an epiphany where suddenly I was like, oh, I get it now. I needed to see more. I needed to see them not in reproduction where they're much smaller, obviously, but to size. And I was like, wow. And that was great. Of course, could have gone the other way too. One never knows. And I went to the show because I wanted to see it because I felt it was important. And it was one of his first really big shows devoted to these industrial landscapes. And it was having that happen, having this after spending, I don't remember how long we'd been working at that point, 7 or 8 years, I guess, already into it, probably 7, having this sudden understanding or feeling for something. I don't know that I understood them anymore, but I guess I did. That was a wonderful feeling. And that was a big surprise to me because I didn't I guess it's not that I didn't not expect it, but I wasn't thinking about it at all. I just had accepted my own feelings for the work. I knew what they were and what they weren't, where they weren't as much. And that was that. So that was a really, really big surprise. In terms of Joseph's life, what surprised me, I think how much I don't I shouldn't be surprised at this, but I think there was a moment where he's talking about just being in the landscape, not his own pictures, but just what it feels like to him and how overwhelmed he is by it and how much beauty he finds. Even in what he would call a devastated landscape, he's able to find a kind of beauty. He knows the history of it. He's moved by the history of it, but he's able to see something in it that is beautiful. And then, of course, that weighs into the photographs. I'm not saying that they're two separate items, but I didn't know this about him. It's not that it necessarily surprised me, but he's kind of a romantic when it comes to the landscapes, not in the way he photographs. And he's avoiding that, I think, at all costs. He doesn't want to make sentimental, romantic, pretty landscapes. It's not that he wants them to be ugly, but they're stark and they're just controlled in a way that is not gonna make you think, "Oh my gosh, I have to go here immediately. This is the most beautiful place on earth." They're not meant to do that. He's trying to give you this other s it's like this again, he's sort of bearing witness to the landscape without imposing a a human quality to it. He's not anthropomorphizing the landscape. I don't know else how to really put it. He's not trying to put it in human terms. Like, this is really beautiful. This is that. But yet his way of being in the landscape, when you hear him talk about being in a place and he says, this is so beautiful. This was this. I was it was interesting to hear him speak that way because that doesn't necessarily there that those feelings aren't necessarily evoked in the actual work. If that I don't know if I'm making any sense, but
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. In one of your interviews, he said, "I'm interested in photographing what's going to finish soon,
yeah.
trying to show what still exists and what is not going to exist anymore." There's a real feeling for that. Others describe this as an interest in capturing the death of things, almost like wanting to record what's about to vanish and having a strong feeling for that. Do you think that's an accurate description?
I wouldn't say that.
An interest in capturing the death of things or the end of
No,
things?
I don't think it's about I get why they say it. I guess it's just death is not a word that I would associate with him and his work. I think it's cyclical for him. I think he understands that things change and that nature is very strong and has the power to renew if given the opportunity to renew itself. And I think he's interested in things, the idea of endings and beginnings in a cyclical way, but ending isn't the same as death. It's a change. And so I don't think that it's just about death because there isn't death in these landscapes. Things have been damaged, mostly by man. I mean, he has photographed a lot of devastated landscapes, whether it's the Black Triangle, whether it's in a war zone, whatever it may, or whatever it may be. So whether it's like toxins that have been put into the landscape or landscapes that have been devastated through aggression or conflict. But he knows that the land isn't dead. It's changed, it's transformed, and it's layered because the landscape never loses its history. So you have all those things that came before and any kind of reclamation or whatever, or renewal that may come after, because nature does this if given the chance. We saw it during COVID. We saw when we stopped how much things got better. Pollution went down. There are a lot of things change, right? So I think Joseph is, in a way, too hopeful to be photographing death. I think he's a realist. I think as I said, he thinks about time or he thinks about duration. He understands transformation. He understands that things have a life cycle, but that the cycles build on each other. It's not like they just disappear. And so I guess maybe I'm nitpicking here, but I wouldn't necessarily use the word death, but because I just don't think it fits with him as a person, and I think he's interested in it because of the change and the transformation and what may happen next because this cycle is over. It's ended.
Yeah, I think that's really great. That's a great description of those landscape photos too. So I want to close by asking you to reflect on something you said in an interview that you published in Aperture. I thought this was a really interesting insight into the person behind the lens. He said, "Everything matters. I don't take things for granted. Everything is present for me. And if something beautiful happens, I try to enjoy and appreciate it as much as possible. We're all different. At the same time, we're all very much the same, and each of us is trying to find a way to be in this world, and there is no one way."
What can I say? Yeah, I think you said it. Or he said it. I mean, that's the man I got to know. And that's why I say I don't think it's about death because that's such could you have a more hopeful statement than that? That statement allows for everybody to be free, everyone to have his or her own path in the world and to find beauty as they're going to find it, and allows for individuality. And that's the person I know. So I can't reflect on it to say that except to say it's true to the person, and what a wonderful way how liberating that is for all of us who know him or read him and can say, "Yeah, I can do it my way."
Thank you for your time today, Melissa. I really enjoyed the book and the glimpse you've given us into the incredible life behind these unforgettable images.
Well, I hope I've said something worthy, and thanks so much for your interest. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Personal Landscapes. If you like the podcast, please give it a rating on iTunes and subscribe through your favorite app. You can find links to today's podcast and more conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. You'll also find a donate button if you'd like to contribute to the costs of the show. All donations are greatly appreciated.